next up, we will probably move straight on. We've got less than 2 minutes until the scheduled time. In fact, we're definitely moving on, it seems. So, hello, Aniketh, how are you?
Hi Tom. I'm doing good. How are
Ver-
you?
yes, very good, thank you, very good. So, first B-sides, or have you been to all of them so far?
This is my first BSides.
Ah,
Yeah.
excellent, excellent. And where do you come from at the moment? What is it that you do?
So I'm from Kerala, the southern part of India, and I just recently finished my bachelor's from Amrita, uh, and I'm going to do my PhD in India Networks Institute and the University of Carlos de Madrid in Spain.
Brilliant.
So
I
yeah,
must, like I said yesterday, all these young people who are just putting me to shame, where I partied my way through university, and here you are doing presentations, presentations and doctorates and all that sort of thing. So I'm very impressed and slightly ashamed. But there you go. Aniketh, what are you talking about today?
so today I'll be speaking about email security and how there is a different protocol called DANE, which has been recently deployed and standardized. So how that comes into email security and how that actually triggers and helps us to improve our security scenario with email. And as that's said, this is an academic research as well, which has been published in Usenix Security. So we also did a longitudinal analysis of how the DANE for SMTP is in the wild as well. So I'll be sharing a few of the interesting results we found from that with the talk as
Excellent.
well. Yeah, yeah,
Excellent. And a reminder for our viewers, please don't hesitate to put questions in the comments field
yeah,
on
exactly. Yes.
your right. We will answer the questions at the end, so please don't feel, Aniketh, that you need to check the question and answer. Sorry, the question feed throughout.
Yeah,
So
sure.
I will be checking out for
Hmm.
questions. And if will you be around on Slack afterwards if people want to
Yeah, sure.
ask questions there?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Fantastic. So, brilliant. Please bring up your presentation, or here we go. And yeah, take it away, Aniketh.
Thank you. So let me just start the presentation and please let me know if uh, it's not in the presentation mode, no, and it's in the audience mode.
No, it's not in presentation mode at the moment, but now it is,
Yeah.
and now it's not, and now it is.
So everything's fine, I guess. Let me start.
Everything's fine. You can crack on.
Okay. Thank you. So as I said, we'll be discussing about email security with Dane, and moving on, I'll explain what's actually Dane and more about our analysis on how the Dane for SMTP is in the wild. Um, Before that, let me introduce myself. So I'm a first year PhD student at India Network Institute and University of Carlos de Madrid in Spain, and my research interest falls into mobile and internet security and privacy in general. And I have contributed a lot into open source softwares while my bachelor's, and because of that, I was a Google Summer of Code student twice, and I was also a former research associate in IIJ Tokyo. So yeah, that's about who I am, and let's start into how the next 45 minutes is structured for the audience here. So I'll be speaking I'll give a brief introduction of SMTP transport, how that works, and especially on the security aspect and security extensions of SMTP, especially for DAI, that is. And then we'll talk about the domain name systems security extension, which is the DNSSEC, uh, and how that correlates with DAI here as well. So what DAI exactly is a DNS-based authentication of named entities. Again, we'll talk about in detail in the next few coming few slides. Then what is the TLSA record? So basically, when you deploy a DAI protocol, it deploys something called a TLSA record, similar to what an A record is in DNS, which correlates to IPv4 addresses. So again, we'll go in depth. Then once we have an introduction of all these terms and all these uh, protocols, we'll start to look into DANE for SMTP and how both of them coexist in the ecosystem and how that improves the security uh, of SMTP. Then moving on, I'll share a few results which we found on uh, complete comprehensive analysis of email clients that are out there, and our results on how the deployment is and if there is any misconfiguration and things like that. And once I share the interesting results, we'll be talking about what's broker, that is uh, the misconfigurations in the wild and things like that. And further, I will provide a bit overview on what should be done so that we can ignore this, we can fix this misconfiguration and have a complete secure package for our email. So moving onwards, why do we need DANE first of all? Right? We already have a PKI infrastructure, which is public infrastructure, which is deployed within the TLS protocol. And why do we need a new one for DANE? Right? So when we use a public infrastructure, we have to always trust on something called a certificate authority, and it's a blind trust. So certificate authorities create their own self-signed certificates, which in turn, the users have to trust. And there has been cases like CNNIC and the DigiNotar or the Komodo, in where the CAs were compromised and misused fraudulent certificates were deployed. So that in turn says that we are in a situation where we cannot trust the certificate authorities properly. So yeah, and here is where DANE comes in. So DANE allows us to actually deploy our own certificate without the need of CA. So basically, we can have a self-signed certificate, and we can say to our server that, hey, listen, just use this certificate when any of the entity tries to connect. So rather than having the PKI model, we can say that use our certificate. And for instance, when an HTTPS connection tries to establish, they can verify their connection with the certificate that we have provided and do the verification process, right? So moving on. Now let's look into how the SMTP transport security is done in the wild. So basically, there are um, a lot of extensions and protocol in the wild, which is developed specifically for SMTP. So here, the DANE for SMTP actually relies mostly on the start TLS extension. So the start TLS extension is basically based on the TLS negotiation itself for the SMTP sessions. And a lot of the mail transfer agents, that is the LTAs, support start TLS. And start TLS is basically for the encryption. And yeah, and there are a lot of research that has been done based on the start TLS extension, says that there is little end-to-end encryption in email. And why is that? Because SMTP is a multi-hop store and forward mechanism, and TLS is a hop by hop. So, which means that some of the endpoints would be protected and some might not. And another uh, use case or another best part of StarTLS is that we don't have to use a specific port, such as 443 for the HTTPS and things like that. We can use the same 25 port number of SMTP and deploy the StarTLS extension. And you might also wonder that there is different protocols such as DKIM and SPF, uh, but that are for the authentication and does not encrypt the entire message. And there is also something called MTSTS, which is simple to deploy, which is the protocol which is deployed by Gmail, for instance. They deploy the TXT record. and doesn't have to provide any security guarantee for the certificate and the integrity of the record. And one of the drawback of MTSTS is that it relies on the trust on first use policy, and thus the initial SMTP connection is trusted without authentication of the receiving mail server. So that's why one of the reasons the DANE standardizing folks decided to go with STARTTLS. Excuse me. So how the STARTTLS actually work? So similar to how a TCP handshake initiates. So basically, SMTP is over TCP. So there is the TCP handshake done and initiated by the client, and SMTP server says, "Hey, listen, I have the service is ready with a response code of 220. You can try to just let me know if you are online again." So the SMTP client sends an LHO command saying that, "Hey, I'm listening here, and just send me the message." So SMTP server says that, "Hey, wait a second, let me just check if you can support a private conversation between us." So it advertises a STARTTLS support with a response code of 250, and says that we can try to negotiate a TLS and have a private chat. So if a SMTP client supports STARTTLS, it it allows for the STARTTLS uh, for conversation to happen. So, but there's a drawback. Yes, and it is that it is vulnerable to downgrade attacks because yeah, when the as I told, SMTP is on a multi-hop protocol, right? And there can be cases where we can do MITM attacks, and and because of that, with the SMTP client and the SMTP server, which uses the STARTTLS service, is vulnerable to downgrade attacks. And again, why SMTP transport with STARTTLS is vulnerable? Basically, one of the reasons is that STARTTLS is optional. So, and that brings the case of falling back to the unencrypted path for STARTTLS communication. And the MITM attacks can, as I said before, can do a downgrade attack and fall back to a clear text uh, based transmission, and which is trivial to do as well. And another finding is that most of the MTAs does not authenticate the receiving server, and the server validation is very rare. And also we have seen that it does not even work. And there is very little incentive to do authentication when the only option is to fall back to clear text as well. And also STARTTLS is vulnerable to spoof DMX record attacks. And one of the use case of STARTTLS is that it helps to resist from passive monitoring in SMTP, while it's still vulnerable to all of this BGP hijacking and DNS forgery or STARTTLS stripping attacks. So similarly to the opportunistic TLS security flaws, it is basically based on the CA model, that is the PKI infrastructure. So again, as I told, MITM attacks is trivial to do, and downgrading attacks is still evident in the TLS ecosystem. And when there is an opportunistic TLS, the incomplete automation for certificate rollover is also found in the wild. Next, before going forward into how DANE and SMTP actually work in together, let me just give a few pointers on how we can improve the SMTP security determinant. So it it must be yeah, the SMTP security mechanism which we deploy should be resistant to active attacks, such as the downgrade resistance should be deployed for even the first contact. Then must support mixed environment and as I mentioned, it's a multi-hope mechanism and end-to-end encryption is rare, we should we should provide some sort of signal which lets the server and the client knows which peer to encrypt, and then we must indicate how to authenticate each peer as well. Just the encryption is not enough. We should also know how which entity we should trust as well. Now into the main game for this talk, which is game for SMTP. So for as I mentioned before, for DANE to properly work, there is multiple uh, paths or multiple entities which the server should support. Server in the inbound or outbound servers should support, right? And one of that is the DNSSEC. So I'm not going in depth with DNSSEC here because it's a bit complicated and it's very vast area as well. So as you can see, it is defined in multiple RFCs. So basically, I'll give over, overview of how DNSSEC works and how DANE uses that in this talk. So, as you might know, from the inception of DNS, it has always been sent over clear text, right? And we did not have a mechanism where the solver could trust an DNS server as well. So the DNSSEC protocol is deployed to add a layer of trust for the users of DNS, right? And the DNS also relies, the DNSSEC relies on the standard public key infrastructure, and it also adds new records to DNS as well. And we'll learn a bit of the records which is deployed because of DNSSEC in the next few slides. The main point why DNSSEC is deployed is that the DNSSEC provides a chain of trust till the root CA, root DNS server, obviously. So this is why DNSSEC is said that is used to provide a trust for the end users to use DNSSEC. Yeah. And it also because of the chain of trust, it prevents fake responses and tampering with the DNS responses. And that being said, let's look into the DNSSEC architecture. And basically, I'm only explaining about the records which is useful for the day. And here are the few. So we create a couple of signing keys. I'll explain that in the next slide. So these signing keys which generates a couple of records for DNS. So one of that is DNS key. That is the public key for the entire zone, and the private key is used to generate the RR signature. So that is the resource record signature. So for every record that is the A for IPv4, AAA, and for the IPv6, then the name servers and the email record is create an RR signature is created, and each signature is created at each nodes of the DNS server, right? And then the next is the DS record. So it is the hash of the DNS keys, that is the private, public, and the private keys, and handed into the parent zone of the authentication DNS record. And then there is the NSEC and NSEC3, uh, which confirms the NX domain responses as well. But NSEC record is not so relevant for DANE for email, DANE for SMTP at this particular time. Then the next is how DNSSEC zone sign. That is, as I mentioned before, how the key pair is generated. So we generate two types of keys, which is zone signing keys and the key signing keys. So zone signing keys is used to sign the zone, the particular zone itself, and the public part becomes the DNS key of that particular zone attacks. Then next we have the key signing keys, which signs the keys for the particular apex of the zone. and and the public part becomes also the public part becomes the DNS key at that point. And this is used to be used for exporting the DS record for that particular group, and that's the introduction into a DNSSEC. And let's move on towards DANE. So DANE RFC was published in 2012, and even with its inception, from from the next few slides in the results, we can see that the deployment is very starts, and we will explore a bit more on that later on. And what DANE exactly does is that it allows us to bound a certificate with with our domain name. That is, as I explained before, if we want to uh, have a STPS connection, we can advertise that we have the certificate, use this particular certificate rather than providing a certificate which is from the PKI. Similarly, I have been explaining about the web infrastructure, but this is similar case where the DANE could be used for SMTP as well, which is a little bit different, and I'll explain that in detail in the next few slides. With DNSSEC, the DANE adds trusted layer of uh, authentication, and the DNSSEC is responsible for authenticating the particular server for with DANE. And because of this DNSSEC, it ensures us for the downgrade protection, and indicates that encryption is So DANE deploys something called the TLSA record. And I'll dissect exactly what the TLSA record is in the next few slides. And it also helps to authenticate the receiver MTA as well. And DANE is used in the conjunction between the SMTP and TLS to fully secure the mail delivery ecosystem, because again it's a multi-port service. So how a DNS based authentication of named entities, that is DANE, work, right? So yeah, similar to how a DNS uh, server try to fetch the records. It fetches something called a TLSA record and the RR signature of that particular record. And then when that TLSA record with the RR signature has been fetched by the DNS server, that our server tries to validate the DNS chain, and if the validation process is complete and it's validated properly, we move on to the SMTP client and server communication. So so since we are advertising that STARTTLS is possible, what the SMTP server does is that it sends a STARTTLS communication with a certificate to the SMTP client. And once the certificate is received at the SMTP client, the SMTP client starts to match the TLSA record with the certificate. So if the matching process is validated and is complete, uh, the SMTP client says to the server that they send over the email over our private communication through the TLS channel. So yeah, in a brief summary of it, another alternative DNS server which has DNSSEC enabled. That is the main point here, that the DNS server should have DNSSEC enabled, and the DNS resolver tries to fetch the TLSA record with the RR signature, and the mail client receives it, and the mail client, with the help of STARTTLS, starts to have the authentication verification of the encryption complete. So next is about how the record deployed by DNS DANE is fetched, and we will move forward on how to dissect the entire DNS. So this is one of the email service that provides email server which provides TLSA record, and we use a particular tool called dig, which you might be familiar with, to fetch the TLSA record. And you can see in the answer section that how the TLSA record looks like, and things like that. So what exactly each of the entities within the TLSA record mean? So the initial one, that is the 25, which is the SMTP port number, and the TCP, which is the protocol used, right? Is denoted there, and then the host name for the particular host that we are trying to connect. Right, advertising that it is a TLSA record. Then comes the important part of this particular record is that the certificate usage, the matching type, and the selector, and also the key and certificate information, which is the hash. So what is this particular certificate usage? So the certificate usage mentioned that if we are using a trusted anchor, that is the CA certificate, the certificate provided by the CA, which can be PKI validated or not. And so with the certificate usage of 0, it mentioned that it should be PKI validated. Then the next is certificate usage 1, which means that it's a host certificate or a friend certificate, for instance, where the PKI is validated. And the next one is a trusted anchor, again, without a PKI validation. And again, certificate usage 3 with host of no PKI validation. That's what the certificate usage field in the TLSA record means. Then there is a selector. So selector suggests that should we use the certificate, the entire certificate to validate, or should we use just the public key? And there is a matching type. Matching type means should it be the SHA-256 or SHA-512? And that's how a TLSA record looks like. And then here we saw the usage and the certificate usage, and the matching type is particular to 311, and it has a specific meaning for all of those. For which one is 311 means it's a DANE end-to-end encrypted, which uses SHA-256 hash. And then there is 211, which means it's a trusted anchor in DANE communication, and we use that if our CA is secure enough, right? And the primary purpose of DANE is to let domain owners use custom certificate for the TLS connection, as I mentioned before, by deploying their TLSA record with DANE end-to-end encryption or DANE trusted anchor encryption. So without relying on a third party CA. If we want to use a third party CA, we cannot deploy it with 311 or 211. We have to use a 0 or 0 or 1, 0, PK. It should be PK validated. That's the main point. That is 0 or 1. Because we cannot, if it's not deployed that way, then we cannot benefit fully from the security measurement which DANE provides. And, right. Sharing the screen. So as I mentioned, there are particular cases where we should be careful on deploying DANE, and how silly mistakes can lead to misconfiguration in the entire ecosystem. So for a proper support of DANE, as I mentioned, there should be DNSSEC and STARTTLS deployed perfectly. And that means the DNSSEC should have DS and R signature records published, and these records should be correct. That means it should not be expired, or it should not, the RR signature should not have any misconfiguration in the hashes, for instance, and things like that. And for STARTTLS, the certificate should be provided, and the certificate should be consistent with the TLSA record for a correct, proper management of data. And next, yeah. So if there is any missing components and any incorrect components within the DNSSEC and STARTTLS, it should be in the case that the DANE and deployed mail servers or a mail ecosystem should not receive an email, for instance, in our case, because there is a misconfiguration and we should not trust that. So we did a comprehensive analysis on the server side as well as the client side. I'm talking about the client side for this talk today, and the server side analysis is in our white paper, as I mentioned before, which is published in Usenet Security. I'll link to that paper in the final slide, or I can share it in the Slack later on. So to do a client side measurement and to see how the deployment is done and how correct the deployment is, we had a test bed, and the test bed is as follows. So we purchased a second level domain, for instance, something like a DANE test.com, and then we created with we set up our own bind a 9 and a postfix server, that is bind 9 for the DNS server and a postfix for the SMTP server. And we started to we created a couple of uh, domain names, which is like some the DNSSEC has an expired RR signature, for instance, or the TLSA record with the which provides with the STARTTLS record, STARTTLS extension is different. So we created a couple of, if I recall correctly, more than 7 to 8 scenarios where this could fail, and we tested it out with 29 popular email service providers. And we'll talk about the results in the following slides. So once the test bed was done, established, uh, we look for how we then let's just discuss on how the test bed works in while actually. So we set up an email account, for instance, Gmail, let's take Gmail in our case. Then we send an email from Gmail to our SMTP server, and when we do that, uh, at the first entry point is the DNS. So the DNS resolver try to fetch the MX and the TLSA record from the DNS resolver, and the DNS resolver tries to look that up from our authoritative DNS server, and the authoritative DNS server, when it gets the MX and TLSA record, it tries to do a DNSSEC lookup and the TLSA lookup and verify if it's correct, or then when that's done and the verification is correct, the SMTP client initiates a SMTP connection, where again the SMTP server will start TLS command, and if it's if this SMTP client supports it, a certificate is sent through, and if the certificate is validated with the TLSA record, then the SMTP connection is established. So here is an example of one of our case that I mentioned before, that which we deployed, that is this configuration in the DNSSEC, for instance, where the RR signature is expired. So when the RR signature is expired, we would like that the SMTP client should not send any emails to the SMTP server, for instance, and because the trust is lost, or the for instance here the RR signature is expired. So yeah, that's it for the test bed. And with the mentioned scenarios that we deployed, we did a comprehensive analysis on, as I mentioned, 29 email providers, and here is our findings. So from the 29 email providers, when we checked for to say that a DNSSEC is properly deployed, we say that the DNS key and the DS record should be fetched properly. And we could see here that only 7 out of 29 service providers are actually fetching the DNS key and the DS record properly. And even out of that, only 4 out of 7 are correctly verifying the DNS sec records. So yeah, and once we were completed with the DNSSEC analysis, we went forward with measuring how much STARTTLS has been deployed in the wild. And good news is that 23 out of 29 is supporting STARTTLS, and which is good. And then there is DANE. So as I mentioned in the previous slides as well, for a proper working of DANE, DNSSEC, and STARTTLS should be deployed properly. And for that, only 4 of the providers actually fetch TLSA record, and we could see that only 2 of them correctly validates them, and only and the 2 others does not even validate the fields, fields as in the usage field or the selected field, and things like that. So finally, where are we right now? So as I mentioned, we looked into 29 email service providers, and our study uh, reveals that there are mismanagement in the DNS ecosystem, and we found that 36% of the TLSA records cannot be validated due to missing or incorrect DNSSEC. And because DNSSEC is an important part of the DNS ecosystem, and of which 14% of them are inconsistent with their certificate records as well. We have also found that only 4 email service providers support DANE for both outgoing and incoming emails, but 2 of them have drawback of not checking certificate usage in the TLSA record. And having this misconfiguration prevalent in the wild, what could we do to fix such a misconfiguration? So, as the simple answer is proper fix, proper certificate validation, then we should provide DANE TLSA validation should be correct, and then the TLSA management should have the correct suitable certificate usage and the selector field and the matching field for the particular and suitable certificate that we are using. That is, if it's a host or a trust anchor generated certificate, we should decide properly on which certificate usage and selector and material, or in general, TLS management should be done. And to have a proper TLSA record deployed, the DNSSEC must be deployed correctly. And also the important thing is that the DNS keys should be rolled over, and we should not let it expire on the drain, right? And we should also deploy a DS record properly in the DNS chain. And as it mentions, the DNS key must be signed by its private key, and which corresponds to the public key in the DNS protocol and the DS record in the parent DNS zone to create a chain of trust. So in the long term, what we should look into, right? So deploy DNSSEC on all your production domains if it's not already, and publish TLSA record for your own MTA certificates, and make sure that the certificates are rolled over so that they never expires, uh, apart from the misconfiguration that can happen. So in the long term, we would like all of the clear text to be turned off and to be encrypted. So that's it for today, and I only scratched the surface of the entire DANE plus SMTP ecosystem. There is more to find, and you can find a lot more details in our paper, which is mentioned in the slide as well. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me through Twitter or email. I'll be happy to help. And yeah, that's it for today. And I'm happy to take any questions if there is. Check if there's- So yeah, so there are a couple of
Yeah,
questions.
hi, Aniketh. Thank you very
Hi.
much. Thank you
Yeah.
very much for that. Fascinating. When you were talking about DNS, I must admit it reminded me of the last time I worked on DNS, which was with Windows NT4. So just to date myself there a little. We do have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
So we have one from Shubham Gupta. Hello, Shubham.
Mhm.
Just put up on the screen. How can I test start TLS?
So basically, what we if you are deploying a SMTP server, we can, for instance, we use tools like Postfix, for example. In our study, we use Postfix, which is a SMTP MTA. We could and those kind of tools generate logs, for instance. So when we deploy a postfix, we could actually have a configuration done in their config files, and say that it should support STARTLS. And once that is done, and when we are actually sending email to the SMTP server, we could see in the logs that the communication is with STARTLS. I hope that answers your question, and if not, I'm happy to help you more in the Slack channel if you are there.
Fantastic. They did have another question. You may have answered it, but can you explain more about Start TLS by giving an example, or is that
So
something for the Slack channel?
yeah, I think so.
Okay, so
And
Shubham, just head for the Slack channel. We have one more
yeah,
question. As for Start TLS, you said need downgrade resistance. How can I do it? Popular software such as Thunderbird can do it.
so Thunderbird is an email client. So so the client should also deploy a mechanism where they should advertise that we are also supporting Start TLS, and the servers that we are trying to connect with should also say that Start TLS is deployed. So when that kind of an communication happens, then uh, then is only there is only where um, yeah there is only where the secure channel exists. And Star TLS is not downgrade resistant; it is downgrade resistant. That's what I was speaking about, because Star TLS for one is an optional feature. So we could the if StarTLS is not supported by one of the entity, it could just say that let's not have the communication of StarTLS. And yeah, and all the communication channel could go through the plain text, right? So StarTLS is not downgrade resistant. That's one main point to keep in mind, and that's why we have to bring in bring in DANE and DNSSEC and the trust of chain command into the whole scenario. I hope that also answers this question as well. If not, feel
Excellent.
free to pin me up in the Slack channel.
Yeah,
We can discuss
fantastic.
more with examples on, as Shubham asked, we can discuss more on the examples with the configuration files and how the logs can look like and things like that, which validates how StarTLS communication actually looks in the wild.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you so
Thank
much for your presentation. You get the virtual applause and the whoop 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 and the applause again because you
Thank
can't
you,
hear us
Tom.
all applauding, so you just get to watch.